Hey, with your evening story channel, I post new interesting stories every day. Subscribe and click the bell to not miss it. Hello, Kevin. I invite you to listen to a new author's story on my channel. The Story of the Box. A halting man of about 40 years old with a tinge of sadness on his face, who still had traces of last night's libations, was slowly walking down the street. Another refusal demoralized Charles and completely deprived him of faith in the favorable outcome of the case. Only 5 minutes ago, the female employee of the personnel department of some scanty firm had carefully examined his employment record book and handed the document back to him and said, "There are no vacancies yet. Come back next week." Loaders at us do not last long, usually until the first paycheck, and then look for the wind in the field. Charles is out of breath with resentment. "Well, take me now. I promise I won't go to waste. I really need this job, you know. I used to be a businessman. Maybe you've heard of it." "Charles, my firm had a logo with the letters of my first and last name intertwined." And in front of the twosome stood the personnel officer and looked at Charles with distrust, but the businessman in him did not recognize the namesake, apparently, of a vagrant ordinary trying to let dust in the eyes of the businessman. How so? There are a pond of such businessmen in the underclass, as well as millionaires and famous actors. A storyteller. Giving the documents back to Charles, the woman thought. At that moment, she was 100% sure that the visitor standing in front of her was a down-and-out vagrant looking for an opportunity to earn money for a bottle. Having been refused, Charles left the stuffy office and sat down on a bench with his arms around his head. In the recent past, he had been a successful businessman and considered himself among the financial elite of the city. His wife had expensive restaurants, vacations at foreign resorts, and a life full of luxury and wealth. Charles, then, everything seemed so predictable that he was sure it would always be like that. The business partners only laughed, hinting very explicitly that nothing lasts forever under the moon. But Charles was confident and continued to close one deal after another. "You'd better not work too hard. That's the way to burn, son, because you're in business from the ashes. Come to the village at least for a week. Have a rest, go to the river, go to the woods. You know how many mushrooms there are this year," his mother used to tell him. Vanessa was always sensitive to her son's obsession with money and tried to keep him from burning out. Charles didn't care about anything anymore. He left for the city 15 years ago. He didn't want to return to the countryside, which seemed to him a swamp, devoid of prospects and opportunities. By his 40s, Charles was a hardened bachelor who considered himself a free and independent bachelor. Of course, novels in his life happened in more than one, but only in most cases they did not lead to anything definite. Charles practically did not help his mother, and if he helped, he did it in a peculiar manner with the help of money. In a word, he paid her off. But Vanessa did not need his money. She wanted to see her son, to hug him, to talk over a cup of tea without the fuss of phone calls. Charles came only once a year, and in recent years he had forgotten all about it. His mother only came to his senses when Vanessa was gone, and even then he was late for the funeral. The locals took care of it themselves. No one said anything to Charles then, and only the judgmental looks of his fellow villagers spoke for themselves. The businessman was a little embarrassed, but immediately justified himself in his own eyes. "I had a business meeting. How could I miss it?" In the pursuit of money, Charles did not even realize that a little time would pass and his life would change beyond recognition. Of course, in this case was not without the help of competitors. Having introduced a whole network of saboteurs into his firm, one failed deal followed another, depriving Charles of subscribe to Depot Pro to edit this document. Visit www.depot.com/pro for more information. Profits. And then, as if by magic, the tax service got involved, revealing several violations at once. At some point, Charles even faced the prospect of criminal prosecution, but it all came to nothing. However, he still lost his country house and his firm. It seemed to Charles that he had fallen into a bad fairy tale where good never triumphs and evil is obeyed by everyone and everything. Trying to find a way out of the situation, he went on a wild goose chase, to Charles' great disappointment. Alcohol not only did not help him, but also gave rise to many new problems that required immediate solutions. Only when he found himself at the bottom, the former businessman realized what the expression of the falling push. All those who used to smile at him and were considered friends now turned away, trying to pass by and not make eye contact with him. Would you go back to your hometown, Charles? The city doesn't like you. First lifted you up and knocked you to the ground. In the village, you'll start a new life, one of his drinking buddies said. Charles turned gloomy. He didn't want to go to the village. To his fellow villagers, he was a successful businessman with a solid, well-established business. But if Charles returned, the illusion of prosperity would disappear at once, revealing his poverty and insolvency. On the other hand, he had no other choice. Charles had had enough of wandering around endless offices looking for work. It meant that something had to change, and in the most radical way. He took the train to his home village. Turning away from the window, Charles tried not to look at the passengers, among whom could be his fellow villagers. The village did not greet him kindly. The locals remembered well the times when he was rich and boasted of his position in society. As he approached his late mother's house, Charles sighed. The old building was dilapidated and looked like a dwarf's dwelling from a fairy tale. But worst of all was the roof, which had collapsed in several places, allowing the rain and snow to pelt the house. How am I supposed to live here now? Mama said the roof needs to be re-roofed, son, and the foundation could use some strengthening, but I didn't have time. Business talks before dinner in restaurants, Charles whispered sadly. Inside the house, everything looked much worse than it looked from the outside. The rooms were a mess, desolate. It gave him a pang of longing. What kind of a son I am, I couldn't do my mother's repairs with all my money. And now he was left with a broken trowel. Go out on the porch, Charles whispered. William, the tractor driver, who had once been his classmate, was passing by. The man approached Charles and asked him what was going on. Then suddenly he said, Hey, Charles, do you need to go? She lives on the outskirts of the village right next to the forest. She's from out of town, too. They say she's a seer, can you imagine? Charles looked at his former classmate with surprise. Why would I go to a sorceress? I don't believe in this nonsense of lies and charlatanism. No, listen, she really has something like that. It's like she gets her information from the heavens. I've been having bad luck for about a month now. The tractor kept breaking down. The farmer was frantic. And she says to me, take a week's vacation and go on vacation with your family. And how will you come? Conspiracy, one read. And everything will be fine, shared William. So what? Did you look prettier? Charles asked ironically. What about it? I was on vacation. A farmer put John on my tractor. He drunkenly drowned it, and that was that. But the interesting thing is that when I came back from vacation, I had a brand new tractor waiting for me. Can you believe it? No breakdowns. Runs like clockwork. That's how Charles would know if he wasn't the seer. Charles shook his head uncertainly. After living in the city for 15 years, he was a skeptic and didn't believe in village beliefs and mysticism. But William had praised the mittens so much that he had become interested in the woman's identity without wanting to. You go, don't put it off. The women don't like her. They call her the witch. They say she is as ugly as a toad. She always wears a typical mask on her face. Only her eyes are visible. So the women think it's payback for her gift. They think it's heavenly punishment. William said goodbye. Charles nodded, not knowing what to do next. William's offer looked tempting, especially after the story about the miracles with the tractor and other little things. Well, I've been there. I've been there. What have I got to lose? It couldn't be worse. Charles decided to go to Molly's house. William wasn't lying. Her house was right next to the woods. Charles hesitated to go to the door. The very absurdity of the situation brought a silly smile to his face. At that moment, the door opened and Molly herself appeared on the threshold. Seeing her dressed in a dark dress and a mask covering half her face, Charles froze. "Are you going to stand there, or are you going to come in?" Molly asked. "Not really." "Well, I just came in." Charles started to deny it. But the landlady had already taken him by the hand and led him inside. It was surprisingly cozy and clean. It smelled of herbs and cinnamon, which made Charles dizzy. Despite the mask on Molly's face, the guest immediately realized that they were about the same age. "But sit down, tell me everything in order." In a pleasantly illogical voice, Molly said. From her emanated such an inner energy that Charles grabbed shyness. He did not recognize himself at this moment, felt like a rabbit sitting in front of a boa constrictor. But the boa constrictor didn't want to eat him. On the contrary, it was trying to help him. Without wanting to, Charles began to tell everything as it had been from the beginning. He was not afraid of making himself look unpleasant in the eyes of the barbarian. The woman listened silently, only occasionally interrupting him to ask a clarifying question. Charles had never had a heart-to-heart talk on the subject before. The former rich man felt as if the words were pouring out of him. After listening to him, Molly thought for a moment, and then she interlocked her fingers and said, "I know how to help you, but you have to do 3 things. Charles visibly perked up and the seer continued. "First, you need to build a house. The second thing is to plant a tree, but the third thing is to raise a son." The guest looked at her with reproach in his eyes. "You mock me. Instead of helping me, you told me what everyone knows. What good is such advice? But why mock? I'm being quite serious. You just have to interpret my words correctly. You don't have to build a house. It's enough just to rebuild what you have. The tree's all right, but the son, it's all in your hands. You're the prime of your life. You can still raise a son. Once you do, you'll be surprised at the changes, won't you?" Molly replied. Charles waved his hand disappointedly and headed for the exit. This was not the advice he had expected. He wanted an answer to his questions about his losing streak. Instead, the village quack added to his problems. Molly saw him off with her eyes and smiled slightly. On the way home, Charles thought only of the seer's words, which turned out to be nonsense. There was only one thing he agreed with her on. He still had to get his house in order. He couldn't live in the open air after all. The next day, he started to repair the roof. Passing by, the locals chuckled as they watched yesterday's rich man trying to fix the roof. While hammering a nail, Charles managed to hit his finger 3 times, making it look more like a boiled sausage. It took him about a week to get the roof more or less fixed. Then Charles began to clean up the house itself. There was a lot of trash, but he did not despair and methodically cleaned room after room. One day, passing by his mother's bedroom, he saw that in one place the wallpaper had become and was literally hanging on by a thread. But when Charles tore them off, he saw that there was a small niche in the brickwork. "What the hell is that?" The man exclaimed in surprise and gingerly put his hand inside. Almost immediately, his fingers touched a cellophane bundle. Pulling it out, Charles froze in amazement. It was money. Several wads of small bills, tightened with a rubber band for convenience. Tears flowed from Charles' eyes. He realized it was all of his late mother's savings. For several years, Vanessa had been saving the money with every pension what he sent, so that now Charles would find it at the most difficult moment of his life. Of course, the unhappy mother had no idea that her son would lose everything and become a vagrant. It was a gut feeling. An innate peculiarity pushes a woman to thrift, having reread the money. Charles involuntarily aghast. No, 1 million was not here, but by the standards of the village, the sum seemed huge. "Thank you, Mommy." "I'm sorry for being a bad son," Charles whispered without stopping crying. The delayed remorse bound his soul like a hoop, making his heart tremble with sadness and longing for his mother. It wasn't until the evening that he calmed down a bit, and to his surprise, he realized Molly was right. Renovating the house had definitely done him some good. Deciding not to delay the second item, Charles got some saplings and decided to plant them at the end of the vegetable garden. Were these fruit? Trees of special value in the countryside. But no sooner had Charles planted 3 trees than he felt someone's eyes on him. Looking up, he saw Molly. "You see, you didn't believe me. I see the house has been swallowed up. Now you've started on the seedlings." Charles lowered his eyes in embarrassment. Anyway, the accident had really helped him. If he hadn't repaired the house, he wouldn't have found the hiding place. After gathering his courage, Charles raised his eyes and looked at Molly. "Tell me, what are you really? You're not a seer, are you?" Molly grinned. Then she pulled off her typical mask with a jerk. Charles gasped softly. The left cheek. The woman's left cheek was covered by a huge, ugly scar. "What about it? What happened to you?" As tactfully as possible, he tried to ask. Molly turned pale, but she did not evade the answer. "I work in an orphanage as a psychologist, helping orphans with rehabilitation. And one day there was a fire. I didn't wait for help and started carrying the kids out in my arms. We're out like family. I'm infertile, you know. My husband tolerated it. And when he got a burn on his face after the fire, he kicked me out of the house and filed for divorce and took a young mistress. And me? I went to the country. I became a seer. Although, of course, I don't have any gift, just pure psychology. But your advice always helps. How come?" Charles objected, and Molly smiled. "It's suggestion. Well, a man thinks of good things, and they always come true. Especially since he really believes that I have a gift, so he follows all the recommendations. It's like a doctor's prescription to take your pills on a schedule. And everything will be fine." It was only now that Charles began to understand Molly's tactics. There was nothing mystical about what she was doing, but her method was working. It was working right this minute. Charles felt a sudden rush of sympathy for Molly that gave him hope for a brighter future. They talked some more and then planted the remaining seedlings together. The birds sang on their hearts. Frankly speaking, Charles continued to believe that Molly is an unusual psychologist and a real seer whose prophecy comes true with jewel-like accuracy. After this meeting, Charles and Molly began to meet from time to time and have long conversations about the future, of life in general. The locals laughed, calling them bride and groom. However, they did not have to laugh long because 6 months after meeting Molly and Charles got married, and a month later they took a boy from the orphanage who became their son. Holding the baby in his arms, Charles caught himself thinking that Molly's third condition was also fulfilled. And now all he had to do to be happy was to raise his son, although to round off his belly noticeably. Spouses in a few months led to the idea that none. But that's a whole other story. If you liked the story, I hope for your support with a thumbs up button for you on click. But for me, that's the best kind of thanks. Good health to you and all the best.